Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel with your hosts Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Try to do most every week, and the main theme of this series of videos that we're doing, simply looking for Christ in the Old Testament, and we hit that theme pretty hard in the first number of videos. Not sure I know how these go, how it goes with me sometimes when I find somebody on YouTube that I enjoy listening to. I don't always follow their videos in order. I kind of skip through a bunch and see one that sounds interesting. I'll watch some of it. So if you haven't gone back and watched the first 3 or 4 videos, especially, we really hit the verses in the New Testament where they make it very clear that they're drawing directly from the prophets of the Old Testament with their references, their language, their terminology, the text for their sermons, the themes for their books are lifted directly from the Old Testament scriptures back through the later prophets, especially Daniel, through the earlier prophets of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel even, and then back through David in the Psalms, and then especially back to the fountainhead, I call it, the source of most of it in the writings of Moses. Mm-hmm. And so even though we've been going through Genesis and Exodus through these sessions, covering a lot of connected ground to the main subject, we're always trying to show where Christ is connected to it, where he's highlighted, where types and shadows are direct references to him, prophecies of his first and second coming. And so, but today we're going to do session number 53. Can you imagine that, Mike? 53.
Wow.
And what is today? May, we're in a new month, aren't we? May the 4th,
yes.
2022. And I've
Yes.
already seen this several different places. I went to the gym this morning. I heard several different people mention it. And I would never know it if I didn't hear or read others bring it up. But today is, what is it they call it? Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you.
Oh,
So you've not heard that? It's kind of
I have, but I didn't make a connection.
silly thing, but boy, it seems like people are wearing Star Wars clothing and drinking out of Star Wars mugs and all kinds of stuff.
Oh my.
I've never been that big of a Star Wars fan, so it never really struck home with me. But
Yeah.
for some people, it's like the big holiday of the year.
Yes. Yeah.
Everybody they meet, they say that. May the 4th be with you.
They're already planning next year's May 4th.
I guess so. It's there. Tomorrow is Cinco de Mayo. It's a big holiday in California. So we have such a large Hispanic population. So I guess to the Star Wars fans, this is their kind of their version of Cinco de Mayo in some way. And tomorrow is. But anyway, I watched our last session, 52. And we started out in Exodus 19 looking at the trumpets, being ready for the third day. And we covered a lot of ground about the trumpets. The role of the trumpets is really important at Mount Sinai, and then later in the holy feast days, and how that every year on the Day of Atonement, there was no trumpet blown, except on the Day of Atonement of the Jubilee year. There was called the trumpet of the Jubilee. It's in Leviticus 25. And so I've mentioned several times to Liberty Church here, wouldn't it be something, because I taught a lesson last night at our Tuesday night Bible study we have here for outreach. And but I brought some of this in, that wouldn't it be something, my lesson was on exactness of time, how that God is so precise in timing of years and days and dates and so forth in the Bible. And wouldn't it be something if that seventh trumpet, that last trumpet, that great sound of a trumpet where he gathers together his elect from the four winds of the earth to gather to him. And he comes riding on that white horse and defeats his enemies and brings his people to himself and sets up his kingdom. Wouldn't it be something if that was the trumpet of a Jubilee year? And that would sure fit so nice into the prophetic Old Testament scriptures. And it wouldn't surprise me if that's the case. We won't know till it happens, but it very well may be on the Jubilee feast of or Day of Atonement, excuse me.
Well, what's
Day of Atonement.
interesting is he does have to fulfill the fall feasts.
Yes,
So it certainly wouldn't surprise me if the timing was along that line, because there will be a reset, just as there was with Jubilee, of the earth and the whole civilization and all of that.
but before that great reset, and that will be the great reset. We hear of that term used today, and there's a group of people in the world today trying to establish the great reset, and they're going to try to add more socialism into capitalism and try to tax the wealthy nations. And it's a redistribution of wealth is mainly what it's going to be, but it's going to be disguised as the best thing for the world, because they say that COVID showed the flaws in our healthcare system, in our government system, in our financial system, in so many of the what should I say? Just the business world, the political world, the financial world, that they claim that COVID showed so many flaws in all of those that it needs to be reset, redone, refigured. And so they're going to attempt to do that, aren't they? And of course, it's going to lead to the false Christ taking it even further into his attempt at the Great Reset called the Mark of the Beast. And that's the ultimate end of what this group of people are trying to do now. So they're going to be willing to allow him to do that because it falls in line with what they're trying to do anyway. And but the true Great Reset, those will fail. They may seem like they're succeeding for a while, but they will fail. But the true Great Reset will be at the return of Christ.
Yeah.
We call it the millennial kingdom, the government that he sets up. And everything will operate smoothly and efficiently. The healthcare system will, the financial system will, the agricultural system will. We've talked about this before, but when you have Christ as king and you have the saints in glorified bodies as his bride assisting him, we are supervising every one of those areas of life. There's not going to be any government snags or bureaucracy problems or power struggles or the limitations of the human brain to bring it about. It's all going to operate smoothly, isn't it? That every part of that government.
Well, I like what you said about the insurance. There'll be one insurance plan with two parts. One will be labeled fruit, and the other will be labeled leaves. It's the great tree of life insurance policy.
Instead of making an appointment with your doctor, they'll say, "Go eat some leaves, or go eat some fruit."
It's a very simple plan, but yet effective.
Very simple plan. Yeah. No,
And there's only one doctor. That's Jesus.
No deductibles.
No. Right.
Anyway,
No hidden costs.
I watched that session last week, session number 52, and we talked a lot about the trumpets and how it's developed through the Old Testament, through the prophets like Isaiah and Joel, and then brought over directly into the New Testament, and how that they copied and pasted basically the language of Moses and just dropped it. You know, drag and drop. Is that what they call it in computers?
Yeah.
They dragged it and dropped it right in the letters that they were writing. And I want to show something. And I noticed in watching that there were some things I need to button up. There's about, oh, maybe half a dozen buttons that need to be buttoned up a little tighter. And if any of you have watched session 52, you may have realized it yourself if you studied prophecy and the end times and the return of Christ and the rapture and all of that. You may have watched it or listened to it and said, well, there's some things he could have made a little clearer, some things he didn't really hit very well. He skipped over some things and all that. So I wanted to button some things up today as a follow-up to session 52. So this might be 52B, instead of 53. But I think this is such an important subject. These it's just so important to understand how that these great themes that are developed in the Old Testament are brought directly into the New Testament scriptures. And we just tend, when we're studying the end times, the return of Christ, the resurrection, rapture, and all that, just go strictly, to Thessalonians or strictly to Matthew 24 or whatever, and just completely overlook the fountainhead of where they are taken from in the Old Testament. For instance, in Exodus chapter 20, after we go through chapter 19 and speaks about the trumpet sounding long and the trumpet sounding loud, and the trumpet is blown on the third day. And we've talked in the past about Hosea's 3 days, the 2 days from when Jesus said, when Hosea 5:15 says, I will return to my place. So that's the trigger point of the start of the 2 days. And down in 6:2 of Hosea, it's clear that the third day is the resurrection. It describes he will raise us up and revive us. So that's the resurrection and the millennial. So if the third day is the resurrection and millennial, then those 2 days would be the time between his two comings. And my lesson last night was talking about the preciseness of God's timing and discussing how that those 2 days may be not so open-ended like people tend to say. It could be hundreds of years into the future. Maybe he's trying to say the 2 days are essentially 2,000 years, like the third day is 1,000 years. And then, of course, there are 4 days before that from Adam to Christ, 4,000 years. And we've gone over that. But here in Exodus 20, when it's kind of summarizing all of that in chapter 19, in verse 18, now all the people witnessed, look at the cosmic signs, the description of sights and sounds here. All the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. So Isaiah 13 and Joel 2 and other places talk about these kind of natural, physical, cosmic signs in the heavens and on the earth that are connected with the return of Christ. But this particular verse, 20:18 of Exodus, seems to be copied and pasted in Revelation 11 and 19 that concludes the sounding of the seventh trumpet, which is the time when the kingdoms of this world become the kingdom of Christ. So clearly at his return. And Revelation 11:19 says, then the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple, and there were lightnings, noises, thunderings, an earthquake, and great hail. So it's as if John is directly thinking of Exodus 20 and 18 and barely rewording it. It's almost word for word. So it gets across exactly the same idea. And this is at the sounding of the seventh trumpet when we have this. So these cosmic signs that Jesus talked about, and we'll go to Matthew 24 now. And last week we talked about the four primary places in the New Testament that speak about the sounding of a trumpet, the gathering of the saints to Christ, his return, defeat of his enemies. And he says here in Matthew 24 and 29, so this time stamp cannot be really disputed with or argued with, immediately after the tribulation of those days.
Mhm.
The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And so these are what we call the cosmic signs that Isaiah 13 talks about, verse 10, Joel chapter 2 and verse 10, Joel chapter 2 and verse 31 are the precursors, or not the precursors, but the initial prophetic uh, writings of what Jesus simply is just quoting from those Old Testament prophets.
Mhm.
And he said this is going to happen immediately after the tribulation. Now I'm going to keep my finger in Matthew 24, and something really important to point out. When Peter preaches in Acts 2 on the day of Pentecost, in verses 16 through 21, he's quoting from Joel chapter 2, of course. And he mentions these cosmic signs that Jesus said is immediately after the tribulation. So Peter's talking about the same event at the same
Mhm.
time. But he says in Acts 2:19, quoting from Joel 2, I will show wonders in heaven above, signs in the earth beneath. So not just the heavens, but on the earth. And that would be what we looked at in Exodus 20:18 and Revelation 11:19, the earthquakes and the lightnings and the thunders and all of that on the earth. Blood and fire and vapor of smoke. Well, naturally, there's that smoke that Exodus 20 verse 18 mentions. So it's a clear picture of what happened at Sinai is now at the return of Christ. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood. Now look at this little word before the coming of the great and notable, and then the famous day of the Lord. Now, these two verses connected together, Matthew 24:29 and Acts 2:20, tell an entire story, and that is the same cosmic signs that Jesus said happens after the tribulation. Peter says from Joel, it's before the day of the Lord.
Mhm.
So many people, especially pre-tribulation rapture people, because it presents a real difficulty if you study it out. Many of them have made the day of the Lord to include the 7-year tribulation period, whereas the Bible clearly makes the day of the Lord, like here, at the return of Christ, immediately after the tribulation, the same cosmic signs. So the day of the Lord is not anything connected with the 7 years. It is the actual return of Christ, and it
Mhm.
is that third day that
Mhm.
Hosea 6:2 talks about. It is that seventh day overall, the Sabbath rest, the millennial.
Mhm.
That's the day of the Lord that is triggered by his actual return, not a pre-tribulation rapture, not anything like that. And it does not include the 7 years. So after the tribulation, before the day of the Lord. Just keep those two little phrases in mind, and that'll force you to the right conclusion
Mhm.
of what he's talking about. You can't put the day of the Lord starting 7 years earlier. So that's a big hurdle to overcome. Now back to Matthew 24, because I mentioned last week the idea that he's coming with his angels, and we also talked about from 1 Thessalonians 4 the shout or the voice of the archangel. And I wanted to kind of button up a little bit. He says in verse 30 of Matthew 24, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. That's Revelation 1:7. Every eye shall see him, and they who pierced him shall mourn, and all the tribes of the earth shall mourn. So Revelation 1:7, the only coming of Christ mentioned, the only timing of a mention of the return of Christ in Revelation is a visible, open coming that every eye shall see, not a secret, invisible coming at all. Revelation 1:7 makes it very open. And this is what same time Jesus is talking about. Immediately after the tribulation is when all the tribes of the earth will mourn. So tie this to Revelation 1:7. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels. There's the angels with a great sound of a trumpet. So this trumpet that is blown, that gathers together his elect from the four winds from one end of heaven to the other, is immediately after the tribulation, and it involves his angels. Now he will send his angels. That means there's a command, whether it's actually voiced or not, probably, but the angels will hear the voice of command to come with him. And the reason I bring that up is I think that is what we go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. I'm trying to just move slowly and emphasize these things because I don't want to turn this into just a sword drill where people are kind of getting confused and lost as to what I'm trying to get across. But in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout. Okay, with a shout. Who is shouting? Well, is it the Lord or is it the archangel? With the voice of an archangel. Now here's my thought, and see if this makes sense. When Jesus said in Matthew 24:31, he shall send his angels. So some sort of command is given from the Lord to his angels. But the Bible has this really important doctrine, this levels of authority, whether it be in the family, in the church, nation of Israel, or even in heaven. So these layers of authority, archangels are over a group of angels. And so it only makes sense to me that the sending forth his angels to gather together the elect in Matthew 24:31 is a command from God to the archangel. And then it's the archangel that issues this voice, maybe also a shout, but at least this voice. Now, what is the voice for? The archangel is sharing the command to the angels under him. And I think that's why this is said to be the voice of the archangel, even though it's really the voice of God, but God is directing the archangels to command the angels under him. Let's get going. And so that's why I'm combining Matthew 24:31 with 1 Thessalonians 4:16, because sometimes people make a point of, well, it's not the voice of God, it's the voice of the archangel. Well, it's the voice of God to the archangel to command his angels that this is what I want done. And I think that makes perfect sense.
Yes, absolutely.
And so why is the voice of the archangel here? He's commanding the angels under him. And then if we go to Matthew 16 and verse 27, it's a real interesting verse. For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father. So that's the glory coming. Again, it's not secret, it's not invisible, it's bright.
Mm-hmm.
Epiphania is appearing, the brightness of his coming. In the glory of his Father, so clearly a post-tribulation idea, the glory coming of Christ. But then it says, with his angels. So I'm tying this also to Matthew 24:31 and 1 Thessalonians 4:16. So these three verses speak about the role of the angels, and they're all connected to each other. And so I make all three of them post-tribulation. So that's one way where it's easy for me to make the rapture, so-called, in 1 Thessalonians 4 to be a post-tribulation rapture by this idea of angels. Otherwise, if Matthew 16:27 is a pre-tribulation rapture, why are the angels needed, for one thing? If he's just coming to the clouds and then returning with the saints back to heaven. No, the angels are clearly connected with a post-tribulation return of Christ, according to Matthew 24:31. And by connecting these three verses together, that presents a real problem. If you say there's a pre-tribulation rapture going back to heaven for the marriage and rewarding, because Matthew 16:27 here says, it is at this glory coming when his angels are with him, and only then he will reward each according to his works. The rewarding time is at the same time that Jesus comes in his glory with his angels. And so, to me, all of this is language of a post-tribulation coming, angels, rewarding, glory, all of that tied together. So just kind of one approach to answer some of the issues raised by those who hold to a pre-tribulation rapture.
You know, Brother Rick, I've looked at these verses and this argument as well, and I just have to ask myself, all the verses that you're reading clearly associate the angels, the clouds, the trumpet, and the rewarding, all after the tribulation of these things.
They're all the same at the same time, the same event, aren't they?
They're the same event. So here's what has to happen. And I used to believe in the pre-trib view. So to any of our viewers out there who still hold to the pre-trib view, here's what I had to ask myself. How many times is this going to happen? Is this actually duplicated where in the secret rapture prior to the tribulation, are there clouds? Are there angels? Are there trumpets? Is there a reward? Then I had to go to the Bible to find out if those components were actually associated with the return of Christ. And so upon my finding, those terms are associated, the cloud, the trumpet, all those things. But they're all nested in verses that are associated with the end of the week. So the question I have is, do we have a complete duplication of these components at the beginning of the week and then to happen again at the end of the week? Well, the burden of proof rests upon finding the scriptures that tie these components in to the first of the week, because clearly they're all seen at the end of the week, every one of them. So the pre-trib person has to find proof that all of these components are tied to this secret coming. And the only verse that they seem to want to go to is 1 Thessalonians 4. Mm-hmm. Where there's no time stamp, but as you brought out last week, the components are there. We just have to go find out when are these components mentioned.
You know, the various components of it are clearly connected to a post-tribulation return of Christ in glory with his angels.
Yes. Yeah. So I had to let go of my view. I had to let go and say, yep, there's only one coming, because the only proof really is that these components are all associated with the end of the week. So I had to let go of my pre-trib view on that.
Well, speaking of 1 Thessalonians, I want to button up another button that I brought up last week that is often This is said as if it ends all argument. Is simply he must come for his saints before he can come with his saints. And I briefly dealt with it last week, but I didn't look at the particular verses in any detail. And I want to try to button this one up if I can. So let's go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 13. So that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father at the coming, the parousia, of our Lord Jesus Christ with all his saints. So a person says, well, before he can come with all his saints, he has to come back 7 years earlier for all his saints, and then with all his saints 7 years later. And it sounds like a pretty convincing argument until you start looking at a few more details by the same writer in the same book to the same church. And he clarifies it. So let's try to sort this out. If we go to chapter 4 and verse 14, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. So who does he bring with him? The already having died saints. He brings them with him. He says it kind of the opposite way at the end of verse 16. The dead in Christ will rise first. Now that's interesting language because that's trying to describe the resurrected, glorified body, that the spirits that are already with the Lord in heaven are then joined to at his return. So this speaks as if the graves are open, the Bible says, and so forth. But that's language that is trying to help us understand a resurrection, because there are many bodies that are not in graves. There are many bodies that are disintegrated, blown to bits, not even in existence, including their bones anymore. So their bodies aren't in the earth anymore. So it's just the idea that our spirits are with the Lord the moment a saint dies. And so that's what verse 14 is saying. He's bringing with him only, in this verse, only those who have died, not those who have been taken up with him at his return, those who are still living. He's bringing with him only those who sleep in Jesus. Now, what about those who are still alive? That's verse 17. Then, after the dead in Christ rise, and those who sleep in Jesus come with him, then the order of things, we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them. With who? With those who are coming with him in verse 14. And so we who are alive meet them who are already with Jesus, returning, receiving their glorified bodies. At the same time, we are raised and receive our glorified bodies in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. My point is real simple. He comes with the dead saints. He comes for the living saints. We all join together in the clouds, and then and only then is verse 13 of chapter 3, with all his saints. So the parousia of 3:13, the parousia of with his saints, is the same time as the parousia of verse 15 of chapter 4, tied to verse 17 for his saints. So the parousia with all his saints is not 7 years after the parousia to come raise his living saints to meet him in the clouds. It's the same parousia at the same moment. I hope I'm making myself clear. It's maybe a little jumbled the way I put it together, but there's an order to things. 3:13 comes after, but immediately after 4:16 and 4:17. And once all the saints are joined together in the clouds, then 3:13 happens, but in the same time frame, the same parousia, not 7 years apart.
Can I throw another curve into this?
Sure.
So with this unified group, those that he's bringing with him, and then those that he's gathering who remain alive, the group is joined together in the air. And so now they're with Jesus as he is returning to the earth. If we were to zoom in on this group and get a closer look as to who they are, who has been gathered unto him in the air, we find out who they are in Revelation 17:14.
They that are with him are called, chosen, and faithful.
Yes. So when we zoom in, this isn't all the saved. This is the called, chosen, and faithful. And of course, they're dressed in bridal garments. We see that in Revelation 19. They're on white horses. So I just thought, well, I'll just throw that in there too.
It's good, Mike. Thanks. I might just throw another little nugget in here. It's a little bit technical, but those who have studied the Greek words and researched this passage in 1 Thessalonians 4 have come across this in verse 17. Those who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds and meet the Lord in the air. That word meet is a real technical word, isn't it? Apenthesis.
Yes.
And it speaks about going out of the city to meet a conquering king or some important dignitary who's coming into the city. And you go out to greet him as he's coming in, and then you turn around and come back with him into the city. It's very much like the triumphal entry of Jesus. As he was coming into the city, people were lining the streets, but no doubt many of them then turned and followed him into the city. It's the same word used in Acts 28:15 when Paul was coming into Rome. And I'll just turn and read that real quick. When a group of disciples came out of the city to meet him, apenthesis, Acts 28 and verse 15, it says, from there, when the brethren heard about us, they came to meet us as far as the Appii Forum and the three inns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. Now, when we came to Rome, so they came out of the city to meet him at a particular place as he was coming into the city, and then they turned around and came back with him into the city. That's the technical word that Paul uses, 1 Thessalonians 4:17. So it does not imply, or maybe does not even allow, this idea we meet him in the air and then we turn around and go back into heaven. We're meeting him as he's descending, and then we come with him as he comes to the earth to accomplish all that he will accomplish at that point.
You know, this same word is also found in Matthew 25:6.
Let's go out to meet him.
Yes. Yes. I've used the word to describe this word, Brother Rick, as impact. The meeting is a very impactful meeting. I mean, think about this. To be called up into the air, whether you've been dead or whether you've remained alive, the whole meeting of Jesus is going to be a very impactful meeting.
Yes, yes.
So I like that. It's got the word punch or an impact to it. It's not just some casual happenstance, you know.
I mentioned the triumphal entry. That exact word, apentesis, or a form of it, is used in John 12:13, where they heard in verse 12 that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. They took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him.
Hmm.
But did he stop and turn around? No, he
Hmm.
continued
Hmm.
his forward movement into Jerusalem. And so it's interesting, Paul purposely chooses the same word that John used in John 12:13 of those who met Jesus as he was entering Jerusalem. But he did not stop his journey. He continued on into the city. Jesus will continue his journey from heaven to earth after we meet him in the air, not make a U-turn and go back to heaven for 7 years.
Hmm.
Now let's keep our finger here in 1 Thessalonians 4, because I want to go over to 1 Corinthians 15 and make a point there, because we have four major passages we looked at last week. We already read Matthew 24:29 to 31, where Jesus said that there's going to be a great sound of a trumpet immediately after the tribulation, and it's going to gather together his elect. Whoever you make that elect at that point, there is a gathering together of the elect at the sound of a trumpet post-tribulation. So if you just hang on to that and not even try to make anything more of it, there is a gathering of an elect, including angels helping out at the sound of a post-tribulation trumpet. Okay, so that's established. And then in Revelation 11, the sounding of the seventh trumpet is when the kingdoms of this world become the kingdom of Christ. So that's also a post-tribulation trumpet, not a pre-tribulation trumpet. So those two, by Jesus and by John, are post-tribulation trumpets of Jesus returning, gathering of an elect, setting up of a kingdom. So then the question becomes that we asked last week, are Paul's two uses of trumpet? We already read 1 Thessalonians 4, and here in 1 Corinthians 15, 51 and 52. You have to really do a lot of gymnastics. You have to work really hard to say Paul's two trumpets that speak of a return and a resurrection is a different trumpet than Jesus and John's trumpets that speak of a gathering, a return, a kingdom being set up that are clearly post-tribulation. So
You
you're
also have
saying,
to say there's two last trumpets. How many two last trumpets are there in the Bible? Are there two last trumpets?
well, let's just read it here in 1 Corinthians 15, 51 and 52. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment. So there's the idea in that verse of some will
Hmm.
still be alive. So there's 1 Thessalonians 4. We who are alive and remain shall be caught up. We're not all going to die first, but there will be
Hmm.
many who will die. So those the ones first, they have to be first because they're coming with him from heaven. Our spirits are with him.
Hmm.
So that's the only order it could be. He's not going to leave those already having died saints in heaven and retrieve his. Boy, there's just a lot we could say about that. Why even bring those saints with him from heaven if he's coming to receive the living saints in the clouds and return to go back to heaven? Just leave those already dead saints in heaven. Why are they with him coming to the clouds? You say,
Good
well,
question.
so they can meet their fellow saints. Okay, I guess maybe you can make a point on that, but it's not necessary to bring them with him if he's simply coming to retrieve his living saints and take them back to heaven. They can meet in heaven, but be that as it may. Verse 52, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. Okay, so There's another hurdle to overcome. Is the last trumpet the same as or different from the seventh trumpet of Revelation 11 in John's writings? Is it different or the same as Jesus' post-tribulation trumpet, Matthew 24? Well, pre-tribulation rapture says, of course, it has to be a different trumpet because it's clearly describing the resurrection of saints. So the last trumpet must be different than the seventh trumpet and the post-tribulation trumpet. Why? But Paul makes no inference, no indication, not even anything to say that this is a different last trumpet. The idea of last trumpet also means it's the last of a series of trumpets. So if it is a last trumpet, that means there were previous trumpets blown. Where are those?
Where are they?
They're not even mentioned if this is a pre-tribulation setting. Last must mean the last of a series.
Mm-hmm.
But nowhere are we told of that series of trumpets in a pre-tribulation time setting. The only series of trumpets we are told of in the writings of the New Testament are the seven trumpets of Revelation. So you have to work really hard to make this a pre-tribulation time setting.
Mm-hmm.
And then look at, so maybe some will say, well, okay, it's the seventh trumpet in a post-tribulation time setting. Look at the rest of verse 52. The trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. We, meaning we who are alive. Now this is very similar wording to 1 Thessalonians 4, where he distinguishes between the dead. They're going to be raised incorruptible, or in essence, their spirits are coming with Jesus from heaven. They're joined to their new bodies. And then we who are alive shall be changed. So he's distinguishing the two groups here, just like he does in Thessalonians. So with that similarity, if you make this last trumpet, you allow it to be the seventh trumpet of Revelation, Paul uses terminology similar to 1 Thessalonians 4.
Mm-hmm.
You're almost going to have to concede that 1 Thessalonians 4 is also a post-tribulation time setting, a last trumpet time setting. Then I also want to take the time, I mentioned it last week, but we really didn't read it. I said that verse 54 is a quote from Isaiah 25:8. And I want to go over and read a few verses in connection to this. Isaiah 25:8 says this: He will swallow up death forever. The Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. That's interesting. That's a Revelation reference. The rebuke of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. But the context that Paul quotes of the resurrection of saints at the last trumpet, the context of it is verse 9, it shall be in that day. If you follow that little phrase, in that day, it is clearly talking about the day of the Lord that we've already established is after the tribulation. The cosmic signs happen just before the day of the Lord, just after the tribulation. So right there, immediately before the return of Christ, at the end of the tribulation, are those cosmic signs said to happen before the day of the Lord. So in that day is the day of the Lord. And yet Paul is quoting from verse 8 in 1 Corinthians 15:54 in context of the resurrection of saints at the last trump. So again, this idea of finding the root or the foundation or the fountainhead of these New Testament prophetic passages, where are they in the Old Testament? and you start tracing them back like this, you realize Paul is quoting a passage in Isaiah 25:8 that in context of 25:9 is the actual return of Christ to defeat his enemies and set up his kingdom, the day of the Lord. Then you go to 26:19. All of these in Isaiah are connected together. 26:19, your dead shall live, but when will they live? That's talking about the resurrection. It's talking about the same as Paul is quoting from in 25:8 in 1 Corinthians 15:54 of the resurrection of saints. And in 26:19, when is this? It's interesting. When is this? Verse 17, after the travail.
Mm-hmm.
After the travail. The idea here in verse 19 is the idea in the New American Standard does say, in some other modern English translations, at the end of verse 19, the earth shall cast out the dead.
Yeah.
They say the earth shall give birth. The idea is that, the resurrection of bodies from the graves is like the earth giving birth to new bodies. And so it's after a travail, just like a woman in travail, finally the new body comes out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're going to receive new bodies. So the picture is the earth giving birth to new bodies. And that can lead to some things that people have real trouble with. But your dead shall live together with my dead body. So Isaiah's personal resurrection. They shall arise, wake and sing, you who dwell in dust. For your dew is like the dew of herbs. The earth shall cast out or give birth to the dead. And it's after a travail. After the tribulation is described as a woman in travail, many
Mm-hmm.
places in the Bible. So again, a post-tribulation time setting. And when is all this? I'm sure you've said many times, and I have, a lot of times chapter divisions and so forth can present a problem because we tend to think that it's a whole new subject. But these
Mm-hmm.
chapters in Isaiah, chapter 24 through 27, actually, is often called Isaiah's little apocalypse. They're all connected together. They're all in the same context of time. It's kind of like Isaiah's condensed version of the book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
These 4 chapters. And so chapter 27 continues the same subject, the same time setting. It says in Isaiah 27:12, it shall come to pass in that day, so the day of the Lord, that the Lord will thresh from the channel of the river to the brook of Egypt. You shall be gathered one by one, O you children of Israel. There's a resurrection, a gathering. Verse 13, so it shall be in that day, the day of the Lord, post-tribulation, which we already looked at, that the great trumpet will be blown. Well, there's the source right there, all the way back to Exodus 19. But Isaiah borrows from Moses, and then Paul borrows from both of them.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus borrows from both of them. The great trumpet will be blown. I mean, that's just like, again, cut and paste or drag and drop or whatever, isn't it? It's like they're just reaching back to Isaiah and grabbing hold of it and saying, I think that fits right here.
Mm-hmm.
They will come who are about to perish in the land of Assyria, those who are outcast in the land of Egypt, and should worship the Lord in the holy mount at Jerusalem. That's the start of the millennial. But that great trumpet will be blown. That's the great trumpet that Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24, the one John spoke about in Revelation 11, the one Paul spoke about 1 Corinthians 15, the same trumpet that he speaks about in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I guess there are ways around it. I don't know. I've heard people try to get around it, make them different trumpets and all that, but you really start tying them into these great Old Testament texts. I just don't see a way to separate Paul's trumpets from Jesus and John's trumpets.
Well, yes, and not only that, but I mean, we're looking at these prophets, Isaiah, and then I was thinking of Job. Job looked forward to the return of the Lord, and it wasn't to some secret rapture he was looking for. He tied in his own resurrection when Jesus will stand on the earth.
That's a good
And
point.
so,
It's a real good point, Mike.
yeah,
His resurrection is the same as Isaiah's resurrection, is the same as Daniel's resurrection in
yes,
12:2,
yes,
is the same resurrection as Paul's.
yes,
And Job says it's when he stands on the earth is
yes,
when I will be raised to see him. In my
yeah,
flesh, I will see him.
yeah,
That's a strong point, Mike. Thanks for
you bet.
thanks for fixing that button even a little bit tighter.
We sewed it closed.
And then how did you title session 52? Something about for some it's going to be darkness and some it's going to be light, or something like
Yes,
some
yeah,
it's going to be bad, some it's going to be good.
yes,
Something I forget your exact title.
yeah, yeah.
So I want to deal with that a little bit because I like that. In 2 Thessalonians 1, to me this is just further confirmation. Uh, the same writer who wrote about the rapture of 1 Thessalonians 4 is the same writer writing to the same church about the same subject in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Of course he is, because chapter 2 starts out with the two events of the coming, the parousia of our Lord Jesus Christ, and our gathering together to him.
Hmm.
It's clearly talking about that subject. But you go back to verse 5 of chapter 1, which is manifest evidence of the righteous judgment of God, that you may be counted worthy of the kingdom of God, for which you also suffer, since it is a righteous thing.
Hmm.
If you want to make a good sermon outline, the three
Yeah,
R's of
yeah,
these
right.
verses. Righteous is one of the R's. With God to repay with tribulation those who trouble you, and to give you who are troubled rest, repayment, and righteous.
Hmm.
Both of these things are righteous, and they happen at the same time. When is the repayment? When is the rest? Well, a fourth R. When the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven, there's the angels again with his mighty angels. So verse 7 can be added to the other three angel verses we looked at, where he's coming back with his angels to do what? To repay his enemies and to
Hmm.
give his saints rest. But it's the
Hmm.
same time setting. He's not talking about 7 years apart or anything like that.
Hmm.
It's the same revealing, the same rest, the same repayment. Both of them are righteous. He goes on to say, in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who do not know God, those who do not obey the gospel of Lord Jesus Christ. They shall be punished. Everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord, from the glory of his power. When? That word when is really important. That's the timestamp.
Hmm.
When he comes in that day to be glorified in his saints. He's not
Hmm.
glorified in his saints 7 years earlier. He's
Right.
glorified in his saints at the same time he punishes his enemies,
Hmm.
and to be admired among all those who believe, because our testimony among you was believed. So the revenge and the rest both are at the revelation of Jesus Christ.
Hmm. You know,
So
Brother Rick, getting back to that title and how we separated out one event, but people will respond to it from two different perspectives, either rejoicing or fearfulness. I remember last week I was trying to find a verse that kind of seemed to kind of go along with that thought, and I found it.
hmm.
It's in Hosea chapter 5, 18 and 19, and I have it here if you'd like me to read it.
Is it Hosea? I
I'm
think,
sorry, Amos. I'm sorry,
yeah,
Amos.
there's none of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Amos.
Amos.
I'll read it from the New King James. Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord, or in other words, the kingdom. Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord, for what good is the day of the Lord to you? It will be darkness and not light. It will be as though a man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or as though he went into the house, leaned on his hand on the wall, and a serpent bit him. Is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light? It is not very dark with no brightness in it. And so he's clearly indicating that it's not going to be all cookies and cream for everybody. When this trumpet blows, it's not going to be a good day for some.
Well, we also looked in Joel 2 last week that many people say that great trumpet that is blown in the first part of that chapter, and it's darkness and gloominess and all that kind of thing, that can't be the resurrection because it's only describing a very dark scene. But we go down further into Joel chapter 2, and it speaks also of a trumpet that is blown, and it mentions the bride and bridegroom. So it's the same chapter, the same writer, the same trumpet. As you said last week, both happen at the same time. So don't separate those two mentions of the trumpet in Joel chapter 2. They're basically saying the same thing as here in 2 Thessalonians 1. That the destruction of the enemy and the rescue of the righteous and the rest that he gives us, it happens at the same coming, same time period.
Mm-hmm.
And then another button I want to try to button up a little better. I think you said some good things about this last week. Often it is simply said, a person who holds to the pre-tribulation rapture, and I'm not saying everyone, I don't want to accuse anyone watching this video. I'm just saying my own experience has been that sometimes they don't feel like they need to produce any passage describing a resurrection in a pre-tribulation time setting. Of course, that's because there is none. But no kind of proof needs to be offered. All you need to do is quote 1 Thessalonians 5:9. We're not appointed to wrath.
Mm-hmm.
As if that settles everything. It must mean we're gone. It must mean a pre-tribulation rapture. We're safe in heaven when he pours out his wrath. It can mean no other thing, and that seals the deal. And I mentioned last week that 1 Thessalonians 5:9, not appointed to wrath. In Revelation 3:10, I will keep you from the hour of trial, should come upon all the earth. Those two are given added weight and importance for the very reason there are no passages that describe a return of Christ and a resurrection of saints clearly in a pre-tribulation time setting. So because of that, added emphasis must be placed on these two verses to try to settle the argument, and then to say that there's only one conclusion that can be reached, is that we must be gone. But you mentioned, and I think I did too, that if you look a little bit, and that wrath of God in 1 Thessalonians 5:9, if you look through 1 Thessalonians, the whole book, the idea of the wrath of God, I think in 1:10, it's not necessarily talking about the bowls of wrath in Revelation. It may be more talking about the eternal wrath of God, eternal condemnation and separation from God, more than just a limited time period of bowls of wrath described in Revelation. But be that as it may, we also said that if it is talking about the wrath of God being poured out on those 7 vials or 7 bowls in Revelation, that means we must be gone. First of all, in order to say we must be gone from the whole 7 years, is to say that the whole 7 years is the wrath of God. And that really cannot be. That can't hold up. You know that the first 3.5 years is a time of false peace, that the Great Tribulation itself really is triggered at the middle with the abomination of desolation and the casting out of Satan to the earth, setting up of the mark of the beast and all of that. So to say that we must be gone to escape the wrath of God can take you still at least to the middle of the 7 years. It doesn't have to be before the 7 years. So that's one point to make. And then it would also have to mean that all of the seals, all of the trumpets, and then all of the bowls are all the wrath of God. But the only thing that is actually called the wrath of God are the 7 bowls, 7 vials, and those seem to be right at the very end in a real concentrated short period of time. So that's what the pre-wrath, the post-trib pre-wrath position takes. That we're only taken out right close to the very end, maybe about 3/4 of the way through the 7 years, or 90% through the 7 years, something like that. That the bowls of wrath are only for a very limited time. But one thing that both of those positions kind of overlook is that if you look closely, and we'll just look at some of these in Revelation chapter 7 and verse 3. We'll read verse 2 to get the context. Chapter 7, verse 2. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. He cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till, one of the famous tills or untills, we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. So there is a sealing that takes place before a lot of the damage can be done. What is the purpose of this sealing? Well, we go to chapter 9, and the 5th trumpet blows, and the locusts from the bottomless pit. And it says in verse 4 of chapter 9 of Revelation, they were commanded not. So they don't have freedom to do whatever damage they want. They were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green thing, or any tree, but only, I have only circled in my Bible, only, nothing else. Only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. A clear description of targeted or limited regarding this 5th trumpet. And evidently, they don't have any authority to harm anyone else. Only those who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And then we go to chapter 16, where we're getting into the actual bowls of wrath. 16 and verse, let me see, where do I want to go? 16 and verse 10. Then the 5th angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and his kingdom became full of darkness. On the throne of the beast. So again, this idea of limited or targeted seems to be all the way through these. It says in verse 1 and 2 of chapter 16, then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the 7 angels, go and pour out the bowls of the wrath of God on the earth. So the first went and poured out his bowl upon the earth, and a foul and loathsome sore came upon, I could just say only, upon the men who had the mark of the beast and those who worship his image. Now, we can do all sorts of mental gymnastics and arguments and make points about it'd be impossible for some to escape this. It's so widespread and it's so damaging and everything. But it seems as if the Lord is purposely emphasizing that these are limited to those who have the mark of the beast, not allowed on those who have the seal of God in their foreheads.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever way you want to think that God's protecting them or keeping them from these bowls of wrath affecting them, that's not, it doesn't change the argument. The argument is God is saying these are limited and targeted.
Mm-hmm.
And so to say that you're not appointed to wrath, well, yeah, you're not appointed to wrath because he's making sure that these are restricted to those who have the mark of the beast.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way, not around, but that's the way to explain 1 Thessalonians 5:9. It does not have to mean that we are physically taken out of the earth.
Right.
Not be affected by that wrath.
Mm-hmm.
It does not mean you don't have to conclude that.
If any harm comes to the saints during this period, it's not by the hand of God, it's by the hand of the Antichrist.
Well, it says in chapter 12 that he brings great wrath with him when he's cast to the earth because he knows he has a short time. There is a wrath of Satan. There is a wrath of Antichrist.
Yes.
Clearly. I mean, saints are going to be martyred. They're going to be punished. They're going to be chased after. They're going to seek to destroy them. It says in chapter 13, he's to the point of overcoming them. So there's going to be a whole lot of danger and wrath and all that to the saints, just not from God.
Right.
God's wrath is poured out on his enemies.
Mm-hmm.
So don't use 1 Thessalonians 5:9 if you are pre-tribulation rapture as an end all and be all to end the argument. Just go read those verses in Revelation. God is clearly limiting and targeting his wrath to his enemies. And then finally, one last button to close up, and then because we're in a little bit danger of people saying, well, you kind of went over a lot of this last session, but maybe not in this much detail or trying to clarify some of the things we didn't clarify last time. And the other famous verse used is 3:10 of Revelation. Because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial, which shall come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. So this is said to be, even though it's to the church at Philadelphia, it is to a particular local church living in a particular geographic place. This is said to mean the church, the saints, escaping the tribulation period, Daniel's 70th week. Again, people say that's the only conclusion that can be reached. But if you just step back a little bit and first of all realize this is written to a particular local church in a particular geographic place about a particular hour of trial. It says come upon all the world, and people say, well, that must mean the great tribulation of Daniel's 70th week. But often in the Bible, the idea of the world is speaking about the Roman Empire, not necessarily China or India or Hawaii or something like that. So history tells us there were periods of severe trials upon Christians. Different Roman emperors, Diocletian and Nero and others, brought upon Christians and killed a lot of them, persecuted a lot of them, outlawed Christianity for different periods of time. So this is a particular promise to a particular church that the Lord's going to spare them from that, whatever that is. To necessarily conclude is talking about the Great Tribulation, is reading more into it, what that passage says. It becomes eisegesis instead of exegesis, doesn't it? You're forcing into the text something that is not saying. Then another problem you would have with this is that he speaks about the hour of trial. Now, I know the idea of hour, days, and weeks and all that in prophecy in a longer period of time. But you read the word hour through the book of Revelation, the last hour. In 1 hour, Great Babylon is destroyed, verses throughout 17 and 18 about God's wrath being poured out on Mystery Babylon at his return. It seems to be somewhat limited. In other words, it doesn't seem to be the whole 7 years. Hour seems to be a very concentrated, limited time. So you have to figure out how you can make the idea of hour in Revelation to be the entire 7 years. It doesn't seem to be that in other places of Revelation.
Well, Jesus used the word hour in that same mindset. My hour is not yet come. So he definitely was referring to a
Well, he wasn't
specific
talking
upcoming.
about his entire 3.5 year ministry, or whatever how long his ministry was. He's talking about right at the end, wasn't he?
Yeah.
His suffering.
Yeah.
And so what did he say also? Where is it? In John 12, maybe? What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour?
Mm.
For this reason, I came into the world,
Yeah.
to go through that out. And so that's right at the end of his ministry, right before his arrest and trial and crucifixion.
Yeah.
So he uses the idea of hour in a very restricted, concentrated time at the end of his ministry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that same idea is brought over into Revelation.
Right.
And so to say, so he's telling this church it's going to be severe, but it's going to be very short. Okay, to say that's talking about the Great Tribulation and a period of 7 years, again, you're forcing into that verse what it may not be saying. So, people hang their hats on Revelation 3:10 as if that is the argument. That means we must be taken out. But is it even, why is a letter to a local church in a particular place in a particular time period, why must it then be transported at least 2,000 years later to mean the saints that are living just before the tribulation? So, it presents more problems than people thinks it does. Both of these, this one and 1 Thessalonians 5:9, do not necessarily force a conclusion that they say it should force. It doesn't to me. Either one.
Yeah. And if this is all rooted in emotion, I don't want to go through the tribulation, and we have to check our motives for interpreting scriptures in this way. If it's just out of fear, I don't want to go through the tribulation, then we have to check our heart, because precious to the Lord are the death of his saints. And so there's no shame in dying for the Lord and being a martyr, no shame at all. And if the other argument is certainly God would not put us through anything like this, then we need to check our history, that God has gone on record as allowing his people to be put under the knife. And so we have to check these motives and why we're translating verses or interpreting
But
verses.
people will say, they say, well, the Bible describes the Great Tribulation as a time of trouble such as there never has been. So they'll sometimes say, well, oh yeah, the Anabaptists, they went through a lot of persecution and suffering, but it's nowhere near like what the Great Tribulation is going to be. Well, there's another way to look at that. Okay, the Great Tribulation will be worse than ever has because it's going to be more widespread. It's going to be all over. It's going to affect more people. And it is going to be more severe in that the Antichrist will be, and Satan pouring out their wrath. God's going to have pouring out his wrath. It is going to be terrible. But to the individual saint, we've all read Martyr's Mirrors and Fox's Book of Martyrs and other history of the Anabaptists. And it's gruesome to read how they were tortured with the rack, you know, just stretch them out a little bit further day by day. The bones
Mhm.
start coming out of joint, the screaming and pain. They suffer for days on end before they actually die.
Mhm.
Okay, a steel pike is stuck up your rectum,
Mhm.
and they pull your bowels out through your rectum with that steel pike, and you suffer for days,
Mhm.
great pain before you die. Or they slowly dunk you over and over and over and over. You know, the waterboarding of their day
Yeah.
was a real common way to kill the Anabaptists. If you believe it must be by immersion, we're just going to keep immersing you till you die. Well, can you
Mhm.
imagine slowly drowning to death over
Mhm.
a period of hours or maybe days, depending on how slowly they wanted to kill you? And
Mhm.
you feel like you're drowning the whole time, but you're not
Yeah.
dead yet. Uh, Burning at the stake was too fast. So they said, let's use green wet wood and just let them bake to death
Mhm.
over a period of hours or days. So they don't just burn up quickly.
Mhm.
Why am I bringing all these up? To the individual saint, it can't get worse than that.
Mhm.
You know, the suffering cannot be worse than those forms of
Mhm.
death. So you say, oh,
Yeah.
the Great Tribulation is worse than ever. Yeah, but what they can do to you to kill you can't really get any worse. In fact, the means of death during the tribulation for the tribulation saints, as they are called, is a very quick and painless form of death called beheading.
Mhm.
Beheading is actually a very merciful, quick form
Mhm.
of death compared to
Mhm.
what the Anabaptists face. So, you know, I don't buy this argument, well, it's just going to be a lot worse. So, that, you know, you can't use the argument of the Anabaptist suffering as going to be, well, it's going to be worse in the sense that it's going to be more widespread and so on and so forth. But to that individual saint, how do you get worse than those forms of suffering?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. And the churches of the Valley of the Piedmont also brings out a lot of these torture methods.
I mean, uh, you study those dungeons of those castles or the rulers of in medieval Europe killing the Anabaptists, the Inquisition of Spain, and all those times.
Mhm.
And they had a full-time hired person whose entire job was to think of worse ways of causing the Anabaptists to suffer before they died.
Mhm.
So what is your job? Well, my job is to think up ways where they have pain that's worse and longer than anything we've ever thought of
Mhm.
before they die.
Mhm.
Okay, so my point is real simple. To the individual saint, it's not going to be worse as far as the form of suffering and death. It may actually be less.
Mhm.
If beheading is the main form of capital punishment at that time, that's actually, I'll take that over what the Anabaptists had to suffer.
Absolutely. And in the face of all this type of torture, uh, many of them were willing to die. They gave themselves up. They turned themselves in, as it were.
We've read
And they,
stories where there'd be a big bonfire burning of some Anabaptists, and it's so deeply affected the Anabaptists that had not been arrested yet or found out yet, they would run and jump into the fire because it so moved them of the faith and the grace that those dying martyrs had. Um, yeah,
and look
it's
at our generation. We're afraid to die for Christ.
yeah.
Our generation is so soft. It's
But
just amazing.
I think I've come to the conclusion that the great tribulation will produce great grace. That the
Yes.
saints during that time will return to the spirit of the Anabaptists and will be willing to suffer and die
Mhm.
uh, for Christ's sake, because
Mhm.
it will cause others to become emboldened, and the testimony will actually become stronger because of saints willing to be martyred. Um, you know, my point on all that is simply this: Knowledge will increase, the Bible said, Daniel 12 says. The masculine, chapter 11 and 12 of Daniel, those who are wise shall understand, and they shall instruct many. And the wise shall shine like the stars, many who turn others to righteousness. And they'll do great exploits. I think the grace will be so strong that we will know exactly what is going on and when it's going to happen. And we're going to be preaching it from the rooftops, telling everybody we know, because if we know we're in the Great Tribulation, what difference does it make if we have a vacation plan next year? What difference does it make if our kid plans to move off to college next year? What difference does it make if our 401k is being robbed by the government? What difference does it make if we plan to sell our house and move to wherever, because the state government is more friendly with my conservative views? None of that's going to matter. The only thing that's going to matter is I need to tell as many people as I can that I know what's going to happen next and next and next and next, and that we've got about 3.5 years left. And if they kill me, they're going to kill me. That's no big deal. But I'm going to try to tell as many as possible. I really think it's going to be more like that. We're only looking at the Great Tribulation now from our current comfortable, safe standpoint. But we're in the middle of it. I don't think anything's going to matter but being a witness for Christ. It's going to cause a lot of us to be killed, but it's going to cause others to become emboldened. And I think we'll gladly go to the death. I don't think, I really, in some cases it might, but I really have come to believe it won't bother us. It won't bother us. The grace will be there.
We'll be looking up because our redemption will be drawing nigh.
Well, love will be perfected in that day. And perfect love casts out fear. I really think we will have perfect love and very little or no fear. We're just looking at it ahead of time, and our human nature takes over.
And somehow we won't care if our team's in the World Series.
Lord, let me just get through one more World Series before it all ends.
Yeah, some things will take a back seat.
Anyway, that's kind of all the buttons I needed to button up today from last session. Thanks for your help. You kind of kept me on track and added some really good information. So maybe, we always put our emails up at the end of these sessions on the screen, but I've not had anyone email me from these sessions. But maybe this session, I'll get an angry email. You don't know what you're talking about. Here's how it's going to happen. So we're just trying our best. We're just students of the Word of God like other people are, and this is kind of how we see it. And if you disagree with us, then feel free to email us. Feel free to contact us in some way. And maybe if you feel real strongly about it, we'll let you join with us. We'll have 3 or 4 people on this, and we'll just have a discussion about it, right? And record it and send it out for. Wouldn't that be great?
That would be.
Someone who holds a real clear, they understand why they believe it. They feel like they have the points in the scriptures to back them up. And if we can all stay in the right spirit, which I hope we could, let's just discuss it on screen, record it, send it out to everyone. Let them hear the different points and let people decide for themselves.
Yeah. So to our viewers, just consider this our formal invitation.
Yes. Sure. If we need to be converted, then let us be converted. Let's try to get the truth out best we can.
Well, I've already been converted once. I was converted from pre to trib, or pre to end. So I'd have to be re-converted.
Well, I was raised, I kind of had an advantage. I was raised with the middle of the week, which is very rare. And so it kind of gave me freedom to develop my own views. And the reason I was raised middle of the week is that it is a 7th trumpet resurrection position, but said to be that the 7th trumpet is in the middle of the 7 years. So that idea of seventh trumpet resurrection was with me from a young age. But as I studied on my own, I've come to the position that the seventh trump is not in the middle, but is down at the end.
You know what I call the middle of the week position?
What's it?
I call it a delayed pre.
A delayed pre. So it's still designed to escape that last 3.5 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So
anyway, next week we'll get back more into Exodus 19, maybe even into chapter 20, and given in the Ten Commandments. And I would like for this kind of your specialty. You've looked into the times Moses went up and down the mountain. Maybe we can count the times. Maybe by then you can say, well, I think he went up and down 3 times or 7 times or something like that. So some of them are kind of hard to point out because it doesn't just say it directly, but you kind of see that he's gone up and down again.
Mm-hmm.
We'll
So in terms of going to the gym, how many reps did Moses do?
Thank you all. We'll leave
Yes.
on that point.
Thank you.
And wish God's blessings on all of you, and just hang with us. We may not be approaching all this like you would. You may have some suggestions or critiques or criticisms or something for us if you want to share those with us, if you think ways it can be improved. But we're just 2 friends chatting about the weather and politics and a little bit of Bible thrown in.
There you go.
We didn't even talk about politics today, but except the politics of the millennial, but maybe we'll get into that next week. Well, we did talk about the Great Reset, didn't we?
We did, yeah.
That's politics. So
yeah.
Anyway, good talking to you, Mike, and
good talking to you, brother.
Stop the recording. Maybe we'll chat a few minutes after. Let me see if I can stop this recording.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.